For 40 winters, Finn Ashworth spoke only to his cattle and the Nebraska wind. But when 5 outcast Ponca women stumbled onto his land, bleeding and broken from tribal justice gone wrong, the lonely rancher didn't just offer them shelter. He gave them a reason to believe that some white men still kept their word. The Niobrara River carved through the Nebraska territory like God's own signature, and along its banks stretched 20,000 acres of the finest grazing land west of the Missouri. Finn Ashworth had claimed this stretch in 1834, back when the territory was nothing but grass, sky, and the occasional Ponca hunting party moving through like shadows on the horizon. Now 4 decades later, the land bore his brand on every fence post, every water well, every head of cattle that dotted the endless prairie.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
But the man who owned it all had become something less than human over the years, something harder than the winter ground, lonelier than a wolf's howl, and twice as dangerous when cornered. Finn stood 6 feet 4 inches in his worn boots, with shoulders broad enough to break a Mustang and hands scarred from 40 years of rope burns, cattle brands, and fights he'd won by being meaner than whatever tried to kill him. His hair had gone silver white, but his eyes remained the color of winter ice, pale blue and unforgiving. The ranch house sat on a rise overlooking the river, built from Nebraska limestone and oak timber he'd cut himself during his first winter on the land. It was meant to house a family, with 4 bedrooms upstairs and a kitchen large enough to feed a dozen ranch hands. Instead, it had become a mausoleum for dreams that died before they could take root. Finn lived in 3 rooms: the kitchen, his bedroom, and the study where he kept his accounts, and the Winchester rifle that never left his side. The other rooms gathered dust and memories he refused to acknowledge. His closest neighbors were the Hendersons, 12 miles south near Clearwater Creek, and old Pete Carruthers, who ran a trading post another 8 miles beyond that. Finn saw them maybe twice a year, when business absolutely demanded human contact. The rest of the time, he existed in a bubble of self-imposed exile, tending his cattle, maintaining his fences, and pretending the loneliness didn't eat at him like acid in his bones. He'd built walls, both literal and metaphorical, around his property, creating a fortress that kept the world out and himself trapped inside like a prisoner of his own making. The isolation hadn't been his choice initially. Back in '35, he'd ridden into Omaha territory with plans to find a wife, start a family, build something lasting on his piece of Nebraska earth. Margaret Sinclair had seemed like the answer to every prayer he'd whispered into the prairie wind. She was 19 to his 28, with golden hair and eyes the color of summer grass, the daughter of a banker who saw opportunity in Finn's land holdings. They'd married in the fall of '36, and Finn had brought her home to his ranch with dreams of children's laughter echoing through those empty rooms. But Margaret hadn't been built for frontier life. The isolation crushed her spirit like a flower under a wagon wheel. She spent her days staring out windows at grass that stretched to infinity, writing letters to friends back east who never wrote back. By the second winter, she'd stopped speaking, except to complain about the wind, the cold, the endless sameness of prairie life. By the third winter, she'd stopped speaking altogether. The silence in the house grew thick as winter ice, broken only by the creak of settling timber and the whistle of wind through loose chinking. Finn found her on a February morning in 1839, hanging from the oak beam in what was supposed to be the nursery. She'd left no note, no explanation, just a silence that settled over the ranch house like snow that never melted. He'd buried her under the cottonwood trees by the river, marked her grave with a stone carved with her name and dates, and sworn he'd never let another human being close enough to destroy him again. The promise had been easier to keep than he'd expected. Pain, he discovered, was an excellent teacher when it came to building walls. The next 35 years had been a masterclass in keeping that promise. Finn hired ranch hands when absolutely necessary, but never more than 2 at a time, and never for longer than a season. He drove cattle to market himself, handled his own business dealings, and made it clear to anyone who crossed his path that Ashworth Ranch was not a place for socializing or friendship. The local Ponca tribe had learned to give his land a wide berth after he'd shot 3 braves who'd tried to water their horses at his creek without permission. He hadn't killed them, but the message was clear enough. Trespassers would be met with violence. The cattle thrived under his obsessive care. Finn knew every head by sight, tracked their health with the dedication of a physician, and maintained breeding records that were the envy of ranchers throughout the territory. His Hereford bulls produced calves that sold for top dollar in Omaha and Kansas City. The Ashworth brand became synonymous with quality beef, and Finn's bank account grew fat with profits he had no one to spend on. Success, however, couldn't fill the emptiness that had settled in his chest like a stone. Money couldn't replace the sound of human voices or the warmth of shared meals or the comfort of knowing someone cared whether he lived or died. 40 years of speaking only when necessary had left his voice rusty with disuse. 40 years of sleeping alone had turned his bed into a cold reminder of what he'd lost. 40 years of maintaining his emotional fortress had created a prison from which he'd forgotten how to escape. His daily routine had crystallized into ritual over the decades. Up before dawn to check the stock, mend fences, and ride the boundaries of his land. Breakfast alone at the kitchen table, reading day-old newspapers from Omaha when the supply wagon brought them. Afternoons spent in his study, managing accounts and correspondence with cattle buyers who knew him only as a signature on contracts. Evenings on the front porch with his Winchester across his knees, watching the sun set over grass that whispered secrets he'd forgotten how to understand. The loneliness had weight now, a physical presence that sat on his chest at night and made breathing an effort. Sometimes he caught himself talking to Margaret's grave marker, telling her about cattle prices and weather patterns as if she might respond. Sometimes he woke from dreams where the ranch house was full of children's voices, only to remember that those rooms would echo empty until the day he died. The silence had become so complete that even his own thoughts seemed loud by comparison. He'd developed the habit of muttering to his horse just to hear a human voice, even if it was his own. Winter was the worst time. Snow covered the prairie like a burial shroud, and the wind howled through the eaves of the ranch house with voices that sounded almost human. Finn would sit by his fireplace, whiskey glass in hand, and wonder what his life might have been if he'd chosen differently. If he'd sold the ranch after Margaret died. If he'd moved back east where people lived close enough to matter to each other. If he'd learned to forgive instead of building walls. But regret was a luxury he couldn't afford. The ranch demanded attention, the cattle needed care, and self-pity was just another form of weakness that he couldn't allow himself to indulge. So Finn endured, season after season, year after year, telling himself that isolation was strength and solitude was freedom. He'd survived the panic of '57, the Civil War draft riots, cholera outbreaks, and Indian raids that had driven lesser men from the territory. He was Finn Ashworth, owner of the finest cattle operation in Nebraska, and he needed nobody. The lie had become so familiar he almost believed it himself. Almost. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the prairie stretched empty in all directions and the wind carried no sounds but its own voice, Finn sometimes wondered if strength was just another word for cowardice. The morning of October 15, 1874, began like any other. Finn woke before sunrise, pulled on clothes that carried the scent of leather and tobacco, and walked out to check on his stock. The autumn air bit at his face with the promise of early winter, and the grass crunched under his boots with frost that would melt by noon. His cattle were gathered near the creek, steam rising from their bodies in the cold air.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Everything looked normal, orderly, exactly as it should be on a well-managed ranch. But as he saddled his horse, a sturdy bay Mari named Sage, something, felt different in the air. A tension that made the hair on his arms stand up. As Finn rode the northern boundary of his property, the feeling of wrongness grew stronger. The usual morning sounds were muted, as if the prairie itself was holding its breath. Even Sage seemed nervous, her ears flicking at sounds Finn couldn't hear. He'd learned to trust animal instincts over the years, so he loosened his Winchester. In its saddle scabbard and rode with heightened awareness. Birds that should have been singing their dawn chorus remained silent in the cottonwood trees. Rabbits that normally scattered at his approach stayed hidden in their burrows. Something had spooked the wildlife, and Finn had learned that when animals were afraid, men should be too. That's when he saw the smoke. Not the thin line of a cooking fire or the scattered wisps of a grass burn, but the thick black column that spoke of serious trouble. It rose from somewhere beyond his northern fence line in the disputed territory, where Ponca hunting grounds met white settlement claims. Finn's first instinct was to ride away, to mind his own business as he'd done for 40 years. Whatever was happening out there wasn't his concern. He'd built his life around the principle of non-involvement, of keeping his head down and his business to himself. But curiosity had always been his weakness. The fatal flaw that had led him to explore every creek and canyon on his land, to push boundaries just to see what lay beyond. Against his better judgment, Finn spurred Sage toward the smoke, telling himself he was just making sure no grass fires threatened his property. The lie came easily after 40 years of practice. He was good at lying to himself about his motivations, about why he did things that contradicted his carefully constructed philosophy of isolation. What he found instead changed everything. A Ponca village had been burned to the ground. Not by soldiers or settlers, but by other Ponca. Finn could tell by the way the tipis had been methodically destroyed. Belongings scattered rather than stolen, horses driven off rather than captured. This was punishment, not warfare. Justice according to tribal law, swift and absolute. The air still stank of burning buffalo hide and smoldering lodge poles. Smoke drifted across the scene like ghosts of the lives that had been shattered here. Bodies lay scattered among the ashes, mostly men and older women who'd tried to fight or had been too slow to run. But there were no children among the dead, and fewer women than there should have been. Someone had escaped, and recently. Tracks led away from the village toward the river, toward his land. The trail was easy to follow. Broken grass, drops of blood on stone, torn fabric hanging from thorny bushes. Whoever had fled was injured and desperate. Finn should have turned around then. Should have ridden home and pretended he'd seen nothing. Tribal justice was none of his business, and getting involved would only bring trouble to his carefully ordered world. But something about the scene nagged at him, something that reminded him of his own isolation, his own exile from the human community. Maybe it was the way the destroyed village looked like his own life. Burned down to nothing, scattered to the winds, abandoned by everyone who might have cared. He followed the tracks. They led through a grove of cottonwood trees along the riverbank, then up a rocky slope where 5 pairs of moccasins had scrambled for purchase. Blood marked several stones, and more torn fabric hung from thorny bushes. The trail was maybe 2 hours old, which meant they couldn't have gotten far on foot. Finn found himself wondering what crime these people had committed to deserve such harsh justice. In his experience, tribal law was usually fair, if severe. But sometimes, like white man's law, it could be twisted by fear or prejudice into something cruel. Finn found them huddled in a natural cave formed by fallen rocks along the river bluff. 5 Ponca women, ranging from barely 16 to maybe 35 years old. They were injured, exhausted, and armed with nothing but kitchen knives and desperation. When Sage's hooves disturbed loose stones at the cave mouth, they pressed deeper into the shadows, clutching each other with the fierce protectiveness of cornered animals. Their breathing was ragged with fear and exhaustion, and their eyes held the wild look of people who had seen too much death in too short a time. The oldest woman stepped forward, a knife trembling in her grip. She spoke in Ponca, words Finn didn't understand but tone he recognized. She was telling him to stay back, to leave them alone, to find someone else to hurt. Blood soaked through a tear in her doeskin dress, and her face was swollen from a beating that had left her right eye nearly closed. Despite her injuries, she held herself with a dignity that commanded respect. This was a woman who had been someone important before the world collapsed around her. Finn dismounted slowly, hands visible and empty. He'd learned enough Ponca over the years to attempt basic communication, though his pronunciation was terrible. "Wobbly Kate Snee," he said carefully, hoping he was saying, "I will not hurt you," and not accidentally declaring war. The woman's grip on her knife didn't loosen, but she stopped backing away. Behind her, the others remained pressed against the cave wall, watching him with eyes that had seen too much violence in too short a time. One of the younger women was clearly pregnant, her belly round beneath a blood-stained dress. Another couldn't have been more than 16, with tears cutting tracks through the dirt on her face. A third woman, perhaps 25, cradled an injured arm against her chest. The fifth appeared to be around 30, with the calloused hands of someone who worked with healing herbs. All of them bore the marks of violence, bruises, cuts, torn clothing. Whatever they had done, they had paid for it in blood and exile. "Help," the oldest woman said in broken English. "Please help." The words came out like a prayer, desperate and fragile. Finn stared at them for a long moment, these 5 outcasts, who'd been driven from their own people for reasons he couldn't fathom. They were everything he'd spent 40 years avoiding. Human complications, emotional entanglements, responsibilities that extended beyond his cattle and his land. The smart thing would be to give them directions to the nearest trading post and ride away. Let someone else deal with their problems. Instead, he found himself thinking about Margaret's grave marker under the cottonwood trees, about rooms in his ranch house that had stood empty for 35 years, about the sound of his own voice talking to cattle because there was no one else to hear him. These women were exiles just like him, cast out from their community, forced to survive on the margins of a world that no longer wanted them. Maybe that's why he couldn't just ride away. Maybe loneliness recognized loneliness, even across the barriers of race and language. "Can you ride?" he asked. The woman nodded, though Finn doubted any of them had the strength to stay on a horse for long. They were running on fear and desperation now, but exhaustion would claim them soon. "Follow me," he said, knowing even as he spoke the words that he was about to shatter 40 years of carefully constructed isolation. "I'll take you somewhere safe." The promise hung in the air between them like smoke from their burned village, fragile and dangerous. As they struggled to mount his spare horses, animals he'd brought along out of habit more than need, Finn tried to tell himself this was temporary. He'd give them food and shelter until they healed, then send them on their way. His life would return to its orderly, solitary rhythm. The ranch house would fall silent again. The walls he'd built would hold firm. But as the 5 women followed him across the prairie toward his home, Finn Ashworth felt something stirring in his chest that he'd thought was buried forever. Something dangerous and transformative. Something that whispered that maybe, after 40 winters of speaking only to the wind, it was time to remember how to be human again. The ride back to Ashworth Ranch stretched longer than the distance. Warranted, weighed down by the silence of 5 women who had learned that speaking could be dangerous. Finn led them across his northern pasture, past herds of Hereford cattle that lifted their heads to watch the procession with bovine curiosity. The pregnant woman swayed dangerously in her saddle twice, forcing Finn to call frequent stops that he disguised as water breaks for the horses. Tala, the eldest woman who had spoken broken English in the cave, rode beside him with the rigid posture of someone fighting unconsciousness through sheer will. Her left shoulder hung lower than her right, suggesting a dislocated joint that hadn't been properly set. Blood had dried in dark patches on her doe-skin dress, and her breathing came in shallow gasps that spoke of possible broken ribs, yet she maintained her dignity like armor, refusing to show weakness even as her body betrayed the extent of her injuries. Behind them, the other 4 women formed a protective cluster around Kosa, the pregnant one whose condition made her the most vulnerable member of their group. Nina, the youngest at barely 16, held Kosa's horse's reins to keep the animal steady. Her face still bore tear tracks, but her jaw was set with determination that reminded Finn of colts learning to stand after their first fall. Shappa, the woman with the injured arm, used her good hand to steady herself while keeping watch on their back trail, with the paranoia of someone who expected pursuit. Wappa, the healer, rode with her head tilted as if listening for sounds the others couldn't hear. As they crested the hill overlooking his ranch house, Finn saw his property through their eyes for the first time in decades. The limestone structure stood solid and imposing against the prairie sky, its 4 chimneys testament to rooms designed for a large family. Outbuildings dotted the landscape like pieces on a game board. The massive barn that could shelter 50 head during blizzards, the smokehouse where he cured his own meat, the workshop where he repaired everything from harnesses to wagon wheels. Split-rail fences carved the land into orderly sections, and a windmill turned lazily beside the well, pumping water into troughs that never ran dry. But what struck him most was how empty it all looked. 40 years of meticulous maintenance had created a ranch that functioned like clockwork, but without the human element it was supposed to serve. No children played in the yard. No women hung laundry on the lines. No ranch hands gathered around the bunkhouse steps to share stories and cigarettes at day's end. It was a monument to efficiency and a graveyard for dreams. The women's reaction to his home was immediate and complex. Finn caught whispered conversations in Ponca between Tala and Wappa, saw Nina's eyes widen at the size of the barn, watched Shappa study the defensive positions the house commanded from its elevated position. They were simultaneously awed by his prosperity and wary of what it might cost them. In their experience, white men's generosity always came with a price. Dismounting at the front porch proved challenging for all 5 women. Ko's nearly fell when her horse shifted as she tried to swing down from the saddle. Shappa's injured arm made it impossible for her to control her descent properly. Even Tala, for all her determination, needed to lean against her horse for several moments before trusting her legs to support her weight. Finn found himself moving between them like a sheepdog, steadying, supporting, catching without making it obvious that he was helping. He recognized pride when he saw it, and these women had little left besides their dignity. Inside the ranch house, the contrast between exterior prosperity and interior emptiness became even more stark. The main room stretched 30 feet across, dominated by a stone fireplace large enough to roast a whole steer. Furniture built for durability rather than comfort sat arranged in conversational groups that had never hosted conversations. A dining table that could seat 12 had been set for one for so many years that dust had settled into the unused place settings like snow in abandoned buildings. The women clustered together near the door, reluctant to venture deeper into the house without explicit permission. Their moccasined feet made no sound on the plank floors, but their presence filled the space in ways Finn hadn't anticipated. Suddenly his home felt too large and too empty, echoing with possibilities he'd trained himself not to consider. The silence that had been his companion for 4 decades now felt oppressive rather than peaceful. "Sit," Finn said, gesturing toward the collection of chairs and the long sofa that faced the fireplace. His voice sounded rusty even to himself, unused to issuing invitations rather than orders. "I'll get food." The women remained standing until Tala nodded permission. Then they settled onto furniture with the careful movements of people who expected to be asked to leave at any moment. Their eyes catalogued everything: the books lining one wall, the Winchester rifle in its place of honor above the mantel, the photographs of prize bulls that decorated the spaces where family portraits should have hung. In the kitchen, Finn confronted the reality of feeding 5 people instead of 1. His usual meals consisted of whatever could be prepared quickly and eaten without ceremony. Beans from a can, hardtack, jerked beef, coffee strong enough to dissolve horseshoes. The women needed real food, something that would rebuild their strength and honor their presence in his home. He rummaged through supplies he'd forgotten he owned, finding flour for biscuits, salt pork for flavoring, dried corn that could be ground into meal. As he worked, sounds drifted from the main room that he hadn't heard in his home since Margaret's death. Quiet conversation in a language he didn't understand. The rustle of fabric as someone shifted position. A soft cough followed by murmured concern from the others. The creak of wooden furniture supporting bodies that needed rest. These were the sounds of human habitation, of lives being lived in shared space. They should have felt like intrusions. Instead, they felt like music he'd forgotten how to hear. Wappa appeared in the kitchen doorway, moving with the silent grace of someone accustomed to entering spaces without permission. She spoke in careful English, each word chosen with precision. "I help you cook, is my way." Before Finn could protest, she was examining his ingredients with the expert eye of someone who had fed large groups under difficult circumstances. Her hands worked quickly despite the obvious pain from bruises on her wrists, seasoning the salt pork, testing the flour for weevils, organizing his chaotic cooking efforts into something resembling a plan. "What happened to your people?" Finn asked as they worked side by side. It was the question he'd been avoiding since finding them in the cave, but cooking together created an intimacy that made silence impossible. Wappa's hand stilled on the dough she was kneading, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. "We speak for women who cannot speak," she said finally. "Men say we make trouble with old ways, that white man law is better for Ponca people now. They say women must be quiet, must let men decide everything." Her voice carried a bitterness that spoke of betrayals too deep for easy forgiveness. "We say Ponca women always have voice in tribe business, always help choose chiefs, always speak in councils. This is our way since grandmother's grandmother's time." Finn began to understand the depth of their exile. They hadn't been cast out for crimes against their people, but for trying to preserve traditions that younger men wanted to abandon. The burned village hadn't been justice, but politics played out with fire and violence. These women had lost everything for refusing to surrender their voices to a changing world that had no place for their wisdom. The young men, they listen to Agent at Fort, Wappa continued, her hands working the dough with increasing force. "Agents say Indian women too strong, make men weak. Say white women obey husbands, never speak in government business. Young men like this idea, think it make them more like white men who have power." She shaped the dough into biscuits with movements that spoke of long practice feeding large groups. "They burn our lodges to show they serious. They say we go away or they kill us like enemies." The enormity of what these women had lost settled over Finn like a physical weight. They hadn't just been driven from their homes, but from their entire way of life. Everything they had known, everyone they had loved, every tradition they had maintained was gone. They were refugees not just from place, but from time itself, carrying the weight of a culture that their own people no longer wanted to preserve. As the meal cooked, the other women ventured into the kitchen one by one. Nina helped set the large dining table, her young face serious with the responsibility of proper placement for plates and utensils. Kappa, despite her injured arm, insisted on carrying serving dishes with the determination of someone who refused to be useless. Kosa moved slowly but steadily, her pregnancy making every task more difficult, but not impossible. Tala supervised from a chair near the stove, her injuries too severe for active participation, but her authority as eldest undiminished. The meal that emerged from their combined efforts was unlike anything Finn's kitchen had produced in 40 years. Biscuits light enough to float, flavored with herbs Shappa had somehow conjured from his sparse supplies. Salt pork transformed into something approaching elegance through the addition of wild onions Nina had spotted growing near his well. Cornmeal molded into shapes that reminded him of foods he'd eaten during his brief interactions with Ponca traders in years past. Even his coffee, normally strong enough to float a horseshoe, had been tempered into something approaching drinkability. They ate in a silence that felt different from the oppressive quiet Finn had lived with for decades. This was the comfortable quiet of people too tired and too hungry for conversation, but grateful for shared warmth and safety. He watched the women eat with the focused attention of people who had gone too long without proper meals, and felt something twist in his chest that might have been protectiveness. When had he last cared whether another human being was warm, fed, and safe? After the meal, practical concerns demanded attention. The women needed clean clothes, medical care for their injuries, and sleeping arrangements that preserved both their privacy and their safety. Finn found himself opening rooms that had been closed for years, dragging furniture from storage, and creating spaces for people whose needs he was only beginning to understand. His carefully ordered bachelor existence was being reorganized around the requirements of 5 women who had lost everything but their lives. Tala's shoulder required immediate attention. Finn had set dislocated joints on horses and cattle, but never on a human being. Shappa talked him through the process in broken English, supplemented by hand gestures, her healer's knowledge bridging the gap between veterinary and medical care. The procedure required Tala to bite down on a leather strap, while Finn manipulated her arm back into proper position. Her silence during the ordeal impressed him more than any display of courage he'd witnessed on the frontier. Kosa's pregnancy presented different challenges. She was perhaps 6 months along, her belly tight with a child that might never know its father or its tribe. Shappa examined her with the practiced hands of a midwife, checking for signs of premature labor or injury from their flight. Her prognosis, delivered in whispered Ponca to Tala, seemed guardedly optimistic. The baby appeared healthy despite the trauma its mother had endured. As evening approached, Finn found himself facing a problem he'd never anticipated: how to house 5 women in a ranch designed for a family he'd never had. His own bedroom was off limits, both from propriety and from the ghosts that inhabited it. The guest rooms upstairs hadn't been used since Margaret's death, their furniture covered in dust sheets and their windows sealed against weather and time. Opening them required not just physical effort, but emotional energy he wasn't sure he possessed. Yet as he climbed the stairs for the first time in years, carrying blankets and linens that smelled of lavender sachets Margaret had made before her death, Finn felt something shifting inside him. The house was waking up, room by room, like a person emerging from a long illness. Windows were opened to let in fresh air. Dust sheets were removed to reveal furniture that remembered how to serve human needs. Lamps were lit in spaces that had known only darkness for decades. The women helped where they could, despite their exhaustion and injuries. Nina swept floors with a thoroughness that spoke of training in proper housekeeping. Shappa organized blankets and pillows with her good arm, creating comfortable sleeping arrangements from limited supplies. Shappa burned sage in each room, a cleansing ritual that seemed to drive out more than just stale air. Even Kosa contributed, folding clothes and arranging personal items with the careful attention of someone, creating a temporary home from borrowed space. As night fell over the prairie, Finn stood on his front porch and listened to sounds he'd forgotten his house could make. Footsteps on the upper floors. Quiet conversations in a language he was beginning to recognize, if not understand. The creak of beds supporting bodies that needed rest. Water being poured for washing. The soft closing of doors as his guests settled in for the night. For the first time in 40 years, Ashworth Ranch felt like a home rather than a monument to solitude. But as he sat in his study with his evening whiskey, checking the loads in his Winchester and planning watch schedules for the night, Finn knew that sanctuary came with a price. Somewhere out there, men who had burned a village and driven out 5 women were probably wondering what had become of their victims. The morning would bring decisions that could destroy the fragile peace they'd built in a single day. These women were under his protection now, whether he'd intended it or not. And Finn Ashworth had learned long ago that protecting what mattered always required a willingness to fight for it. Dawn brought riders to Ashworth Ranch. 8 Ponca men on painted horses who sat their mounts like war chiefs surveying conquered territory. Finn spotted them from his bedroom window as he pulled on his boots, silhouetted against the morning sky on the ridge that overlooked his northern pasture. They weren't moving with the urgency of a war party, but with the deliberate patience of men who had already decided how this day would end. Their leader sat a magnificent black stallion, his chest painted with symbols that even from a distance spoke of authority and judgment. The women had sensed the danger before Finn could warn them. By the time he reached the kitchen, Tala was positioning the others away from windows while Wappa gathered knives from his cutlery drawer with the efficient movements of someone who had prepared for violence before. Nina pressed herself against the wall beside the back door, ready to run if escape became necessary. Kosa sat heavily in a chair, her pregnancy making flight impossible, her hands protective over her swollen belly. Kappa stood beside Tala despite her injured arm, prepared to fight with whatever weapons they could improvise. 8 men, Finn reported, checking his Winchester's action for the 3rd time since waking. Painted for war, but moving slow. They want to talk before they fight. He moved through his house with the practiced efficiency of a man who had defended his property before, closing shutters, barricading the back door, creating firing positions. That would give him the advantage if negotiations failed. 40 years of paranoid preparation were about to be tested against enemies who had more cause for anger than he'd faced since the Indian wars of his youth. Tala spoke rapidly in Ponca to the other women, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. Their responses came in whispers, but Finn caught enough of their tone to understand they were debating surrender versus resistance. The pregnant woman's condition complicated every choice. Running would likely kill her and the child. Fighting would probably kill them all. Staying and hoping for mercy required a faith in human decency that recent events had shattered. "They come for us," Tala said in her careful English. "We bring trouble to your house. We go out, you safe." The offer was made with the dignity of someone prepared to sacrifice herself for others. But Finn shook his head before she finished speaking. He'd spent 40 years avoiding exactly this kind of responsibility. But now that it was here, he discovered something in himself that surprised him. Margaret had died because he'd failed to see the signs of her desperation. These women would not die because he lacked the courage to protect them. "Nobody leaves," he said, his voice carrying a certainty that brooked no argument. "This is my land, my house, my rules. They want you, they'll have to go through me first." The words felt strange in his mouth after decades of avoiding conflict, but they also felt right in a way that surprised him. For the first time since Margaret's death, he had something worth fighting for besides mere survival. The riders approached the house with the ceremonial slowness of a formal delegation, their horses' hooves raising small clouds of dust that caught the morning light. Their leader was a man of perhaps 40 years, with the weathered face of someone who had spent his life outdoors, and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Scars marked his chest and arms, testament to battles fought and survived. His hair was adorned with eagle feathers that indicated his status within the tribe, and his weapons were those of a warrior who took pride in his tools. Finn stepped onto his front porch with his Winchester cradled in his arms, not quite pointed at the approaching riders, but ready to be raised in an instant. His appearance on the porch caused the delegation to halt at the edge of his yard, just beyond effective rifle range, but close enough for conversation. The morning air carried the scent of horses and leather, painted skin and weapons oil. These were not desperate refugees, but confident men who expected their demands to be met. "White man," the leader called in accented English that was far better than Tala's. "You have women who belong with Ponca people. They must come back for judgment." His voice carried the authority of someone who had never been refused, but also a weariness that suggested this confrontation was a duty rather than a pleasure. "You give them to us, we ride away. No trouble for you or your cattle." Finn studied the 8 men, noting their weapons, their horses, their positioning. They were confident but not careless, experienced warriors who had survived by being thorough in their preparations. The 4 men flanking their leader carried rifles of recent manufacture, probably traded from white settlers or taken in raids. The 3 bringing up the rear held traditional weapons, bows with arrows already nocked, war clubs decorated with scalp locks, lances with steel points that gleamed in the morning sun. "Those women asked for my protection," Finn replied, his voice carrying across the yard with the clarity of someone accustomed to calling cattle across vast distances. "I gave it to them. My word is my bond, and my land extends to that ridge where you're sitting." He shifted the Winchester slightly, not quite aiming but making his readiness clear. "You're welcome to water your horses at the creek and ride on. But the women stay." The Ponca leader's expression shifted from confident authority to something approaching respect. He spoke rapidly to his companions in their native language, and Finn caught enough words to understand they were discussing his reputation. Apparently his 40 years of isolation hadn't made him completely unknown to the local tribes. Stories had been told around fires about the white rancher who kept to himself, but defended his property with lethal efficiency. "You know what these women did?" the leader asked, leaning forward in his saddle. "They speak against tribal council, say old ways better than new ways. They make trouble with Indian agent, tell lies about how Ponca people should live. They poison minds of young women with ideas that make them forget their place." His voice carried the frustration of someone trying to hold together a world that was changing too fast to manage. From inside the house came the sound of movement, and Finn knew the women were listening to every word. Their fate was being decided by men who spoke about them as if they were livestock that had strayed from the proper pasture. The casual dismissal of their right to hold opinions ignited something in Finn that he hadn't felt since Margaret's funeral, when the preacher had suggested her death was God's will and her suffering was part of some divine plan. "Those women have names," Finn said, his voice hardening with anger that surprised him with its intensity. "They have minds of their own and voices of their own. If your tribal council can't handle women who think for themselves, maybe the problem isn't with the women." The words came out before he could stop them. 40 years of buried rage at systems that crushed the innocent finding voice through his defense of 5 strangers. The reaction among the Ponca riders was immediate and dangerous. Hands moved to weapons, horses shifted restlessly, and the morning air grew thick with the possibility of violence. Their leader raised his hand for calm, but his own expression had darkened with the anger of someone whose authority had been challenged publicly. In the hierarchy of frontier masculinity, backing down from a confrontation meant losing face that could never be recovered. "White man speaks of things he does not understand," the leader said, his English becoming more formal as his anger grew. "These women break sacred laws, dishonor families, bring shame to all Ponca people. They must face judgment of tribal council, not hide behind walls of white rancher who knows nothing of our ways." He straightened in his saddle, and Finn could see the decision forming in his dark eyes. You give them to us now, or we take them. The ultimatum hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire, acrid and threatening. Finn felt the familiar tightness in his chest that preceded violence, the heightened awareness that came when survival depended on split-second decisions. 8 against 1 were poor odds under any circumstances, but the house provided defensive advantages that might even the playing field. More importantly, he'd discovered something about himself in the past 24 hours that changed everything. Then you'll have to take them, Finn replied, raising his Winchester to his shoulder in one smooth motion. The weapon's barrel found the center of the leader's chest with the accuracy born of 40 years of practice. But understand this, I've got nothing left to lose and everything to prove. You want those women, you'll pay for them with blood. And I guarantee mine won't be the only blood spilled today. The standoff stretched across the ranch yard like a taut rope ready to snap. 8 Ponca warriors faced one white rancher across a space that suddenly felt charged with lethal possibility. Horses stamped nervously, sensing their riders' tension. Birds fell silent in the cottonwood trees. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when words would give way to violence. Behind Finn, the front door opened with the soft creak of well-oiled hinges. Tala emerged onto the porch, moving with the careful dignity of someone walking to her own execution. Her injuries from the previous day's beating were visible in the morning light. The swollen eye, the careful way she held her recently relocated shoulder, the bruises that darkened her throat where someone had tried to strangle her. But her voice when she spoke carried no trace of defeat. "Mecca," she called to the leader, using what was apparently his name. "You burn our village, scatter our families, drive us into wilderness like wounded animals. You say this is justice, according to tribal law. But whose law says men can beat women who speak truth? Whose law says tradition must die so white agent will smile and give you medals?" Her words carried across the yard with the force of righteous anger, and Finn saw several of the younger warriors shift uncomfortably in their saddles. Mecca's response came in rapid Ponca, his voice rising with anger and frustration. Tala answered in the same language, and soon other voices joined the argument. The 4 remaining women emerged from the house to stand behind their leader, presenting a united front despite their injuries and exhaustion. What had begun as a simple retrieval mission was becoming something more complex, a public trial in the court of tribal opinion. Finn couldn't understand the words, but he could read the emotions playing across the faces of the Ponca warriors. Some seemed troubled by Tala's accusations. Others appeared angry at being questioned by women they considered outlaws. Their leader, Maka, grew increasingly frustrated as his authority was challenged not just by a white rancher, but by the very women he'd come to retrieve. The situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. The argument might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses from the south. 3 riders were coming up the ranch road at a hard gallop, their mounts lathered with sweat and their urgency unmistakable. As they drew closer, Finn recognized them as white men, probably from the territorial government, based on their clothes and the official-looking saddlebags they carried. Their arrival would complicate an already dangerous situation. The newcomers proved to be Indian Agent Samuel Morrison, a thin man with the pallor of someone who spent too much time indoors, accompanied by 2 territorial marshals whose badges caught the morning sun. Morrison's horse was blowing hard from the rapid ride, and his clothes showed the dust and sweat of someone who had been traveling since before dawn. His expression suggested this was not a social call. "What's the meaning of this?" Morrison demanded, taking in the scene with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to diffusing volatile situations. His eyes moved from the Ponca warriors to Finn's raised rifle, to the 5 women standing on the porch, cataloging details that would determine his approach. "Agent Morrison, Bureau of Indian Affairs. Lower your weapon, rancher, and let's discuss." This like civilized men. Finn's rifle remained trained on Maka, but he spoke without taking his eyes off the Ponca leader. These women asked for sanctuary on my land. I gave it to them. Now their own people want to drag them back for the crime of having opinions. I'm disinclined to allow that. His voice carried the flat certainty of someone who had made his decision and would live or die by it. Morrison dismounted and approached the porch with the careful movements of someone trying not to trigger violence. His experience with frontier disputes had taught him that wounded pride and loaded weapons made for deadly combinations. Mr. Ashworth, I presume? I've heard of your ranch. Fine operation you've built here. The compliment was calculated to establish common ground, but his eyes never left the rifle in Finn's hands. These women are fugitives from tribal justice, Morrison continued, pulling documents from his saddlebag with practiced efficiency. They've been accused of sedition, of encouraging other women to resist the authority of the tribal council. The Indian Agency has worked very hard to establish peaceful relations with the Ponca nation, and that peace depends on respecting their internal governance structure. Tala stepped forward, her voice cutting through Morrison's diplomatic language. With the sharp edge of lived experience. Internal governance? You mean white man's law imposed on Ponca people who never agreed to abandon our traditions? You mean councils of young men who take orders from you instead of wisdom from elders? Her English was becoming stronger with anger, as if fury was burning away her uncertainty with the foreign language. The Indian agent's face flushed with irritation at being contradicted by a woman, especially an Indian woman whose legal status was questionable at best. These women have no standing to question decisions made by their properly elected tribal leaders. The Department of the Interior has recognized the current Ponca Council as the legitimate governing body, and their authority extends to all tribal members regardless of gender, elected. Waipa's voice joined the argument, her healer's training, having given her experience in speaking truth to power. Chosen by you from men who promised to obey white laws instead of Ponca ways, where were the women when these elections happened? Where were the elders who remember how our people lived? Before treaties and agencies and reservations? Her question struck at the heart of the controversy, challenging the legitimacy of the very system Morrison represented. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows and raising the temperature both literally and figuratively. Sweat beaded on faces strained with tension, and horses grew restless under riders who gripped reins with white knuckles. The standoff had become a complex negotiation involving not just the immediate fate of 5 women, but the broader question of who had the right to define justice in a territory where cultures collided daily. Finn found himself at the center of forces he barely understood, holding a rifle on men who believed they were enforcing legitimate law while protecting women who claimed to represent traditional justice. His simple offer of sanctuary had become a flashpoint in a cultural war that extended far beyond his ranch boundaries. But as he looked at the 5 women standing behind him, still bruised from the beating they'd received for speaking their minds, his resolve only hardened. Agent Morrison, Finn said without lowering his weapon, I don't care about your treaties or your tribal councils or your territorial authority. These women are on my land, under my protection, and they'll stay here until they decide otherwise. If that makes me an outlaw, so be it. But they're not leaving unless they choose to go. The words committed him to a course of action that would change his life forever, transforming him from a reclusive rancher into a man willing to defy both tribal law and territorial authority for the sake of 5 women he'd known for less than 24 hours. As the various factions stared at each other across the ranch yard, each waiting for someone else to make the first move, Finn Ashworth discovered that 40 years of isolation had not destroyed his capacity for moral courage. It had only been waiting for a cause worthy of the risk. The crack of a rifle shot split the morning air like thunder, but it came from neither Finn's Winchester nor the weapons of the Ponca warriors. Instead, it originated from the ridge behind the ranch house, where a lone figure stood silhouetted against the brightening sky. The bullet kicked up dust between the two groups, a warning shot fired by someone who commanded attention through the simple expedient of superior positioning and marksmanship. All eyes turned toward the ridge as the shooter descended the slope. With the unhurried confidence of someone who held all the advantages, the figure resolved into an elderly Ponca woman, perhaps 70 years old, carrying a Henry rifle with the casual familiarity of someone who had been using firearms since before most of the men in the yard were born. Her hair was white as winter snow, braided with silver ornaments that caught the sunlight, and her face bore the weathered dignity of someone who had seen the rise and fall of nations. "Grandmother," Maka breathed, his voice carrying a mixture of reverence and fear that transformed him from confident war leader to uncertain grandson. The other Ponca warriors immediately lowered their weapons, their aggressive postures melting into respectful attention. Even Agent Morrison seemed to recognize that the arrival of this woman had fundamentally altered the dynamics of their confrontation. The elderly woman approached the group with measured steps, her rifle held ready but not threatening. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had been making life and death decisions since before any of the men present were born. Her English was flawless, educated, speaking to years of interaction with white society on terms of equality rather than subjugation. "I am Nanama, keeper of the old ways, speaker for women who no longer have voices in council." She gestured toward the 5 women on Finn's porch with her rifle barrel. "These daughters of our people came to me in the darkness, bleeding from the justice of young men who think tradition is weakness and change is strength. I sent them to this white man because I know his heart, even if he has forgotten it himself." Finn stared at the elderly woman with growing recognition, memories surfacing from 40 years of determined forgetfulness. Nanama had been among the Ponca delegation that had negotiated water rights with him in his second year on the land, back when Margaret was still alive and the future had seemed full of possibility. She had spoken for her people with wisdom and dignity, treating him as an equal rather than an intruder. Their agreement had held for 4 decades, honored by both sides even through the worst periods of white Indian conflict. "You remember," Nanama said, noting the recognition in his eyes, "the year of the great drought when your cattle died, and your wife grew sick with sadness. I brought healing herbs for the woman who could not find joy in this beautiful land. I spoke with her many times, listening to sorrows too deep for white man's medicine to cure." Her words brought back memories Finn had buried so deep he'd convinced himself they were dreams. Margaret's depression had worsened during their second winter, and Finn had been desperate enough to accept help from any source. Nanama had appeared at their door during a February blizzard, carrying roots and leaves that she brewed into teas designed to lift the spirit and ease the mind. For 3 months, she had visited weekly, talking with Margaret in a mixture of English and Ponca that somehow transcended language barriers. The treatments had helped, temporarily. Margaret's spirits had lifted enough for her to plant a garden that spring, to talk about children they might have, to make plans that extended beyond mere survival. But the improvement had been fragile, and when Nanama's visits ended with the arrival of warm weather, Margaret's darkness had returned with doubled force. By the following winter, she was gone. "Your wife was not meant for this land," Nanama continued, her voice gentle with old grief. "But she taught me words in your language, showed me pictures of the place where she was born, spoke of family that lived too far away to comfort her. She said you were a good man with wounded heart, that you needed someone strong enough to heal with you instead of someone fragile who would break under prairie wind." The revelation that Margaret had discussed him with Nanama, that she had understood his own pain even while drowning in her own, hit Finn with unexpected force. For 40 years, he had blamed himself for her death, convinced that a better husband could have saved her. The possibility that her despair had roots deeper than his failures opened wounds he thought had scarred over permanently. Maka found his voice, though it carried none of the authority he had displayed earlier. "Grandmother, these women defied." The council spoke against decisions made for the good of all Ponca people. "The Indian agent says we must govern ourselves according to white man's law if we want to keep our lands. These women make that impossible with their constant challenges." Nanima's laugh was sharp as winter wind. "White man's law. Child, I have lived through 7 Indian agents, each one promising that if we just abandon a little more of ourselves, we will be allowed to keep what remains. First they wanted our hunting grounds, then our sacred sites, then our language in the schools. Now they want the voices of our women, the wisdom of our elders, the very heart of what makes us Ponca." She raised her rifle slightly, not quite threatening but making her position clear. "I fought beside your grandfather against the Sioux when you were still nursing at your mother's breast," she continued. "I negotiated treaties with territorial governors when your father was learning to hunt rabbits. I have seen promises made and broken, watched our people divided against themselves in the name of progress. These women stand for the old ways not because they fear change, but because they understand what we lose when we forget who we are." Agent Morrison attempted to reassert his authority, stepping forward with documents that represented the full weight of federal bureaucracy. "Mrs. Nanima, with all due respect, the Department of the Interior has worked very hard to establish a stable relationship with the Ponca Nation. That stability depends on clear lines of authority and consistent governance. We cannot allow individual dissidents to undermine legitimate tribal leadership." The old woman's response was swift and devastating. "Dissidents? These women are the daughters and granddaughters of chiefs, the keepers of songs that remember. When this land was young, the voices that speak for generations yet unborn. You call them dissidents because they refuse to be silent while you turn their men into pale copies of white bureaucrats who have never felt prairie grass beneath their feet or heard the voice of eagles on the wind." Tala stepped forward from the porch, her injuries making each movement careful but deliberate. When she spoke, it was in Ponca, but her words carried the rhythm of formal oratory, the cadence of someone making a speech that would be remembered. Nanima translated simultaneously, her voice carrying the weight of ancient law. "She says that the council which banished them was not convened according to traditional law. No women were present to speak for the interests of children and families. No elders were consulted to provide the wisdom of experience. No sacred ceremonies were performed to ensure the spirits approved of their decisions. It was not a Ponca council, but a gathering of frightened men trying to appease white masters by sacrificing their own people." The accusation struck at the legitimacy of everything Maka and his warriors represented. If the council that ordered the women's exile had not followed proper procedures, then their authority was questionable under both traditional and legal standards. Agent Morrison's face darkened as he realized the implications. A dispute over proper governance could tie up his administration in legal challenges for years. Nina, the youngest of the 5 women, spoke for the first time since their arrival at the ranch. Her voice was clear and strong despite her youth, carrying the natural authority of someone born to leadership. Nanima's translation revealed words that cut to the heart of the conflict. She says the young men who sit on the council have forgotten that Ponca's strength comes from the balance between male and female wisdom, that no important decisions were ever made without considering the voices of both hunters and gatherers, warriors and healers. She asks if a people who silence half their voices can truly claim to govern themselves. The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a signal fire, demanding an answer from men who had spent years convincing themselves that adaptation meant abandoning everything that made them unique. Finn watched the faces of the Ponca warriors and saw doubt creeping into their certainty. These were not evil men, but confused ones, caught between competing definitions of survival and progress. Wappa stepped forward and began speaking in rapid Ponca, her healer's training evident in the careful structure of her argument. She gestured toward Kosa's pregnant belly, toward the bruises that marked all 5 women, toward the ranch house that had given them sanctuary. Nanama's translation revealed a devastating indictment of the new order. She says that a council which beats pregnant women and burns the homes of grandmothers has forgotten what it means to be Ponca. She says that traditions which have kept our people strong for 1,000 years should not be abandoned to please men who will move on to other territories when their work here is done. She asks what kind of leaders destroy their own people to prove their loyalty to strangers. Agent Morrison realized that his careful plans for maintaining peace were unraveling before his eyes. The arrival of Nanama had transformed a simple retrieval mission into a public trial of his administration's policies. Word of this confrontation would spread throughout the territory, encouraging other tribes to question the authority of councils that governed without consensus. "This is getting out of hand," Morrison declared, attempting to regain control of the situation. "These women are fugitives from justice, regardless of the philosophical merits of their position. They must be returned to proper custody for processing through established legal channels. Mr. Ashworth, I'm ordering you to surrender them immediately." Finn's response came without hesitation, his Winchester still trained on Maka despite the changing dynamics of the confrontation. "Agent Morrison, this is my land, purchased and paid for according to territorial law. These women asked for sanctuary, and I granted it. Your authority ends at my property line, and mine begins. If you want them, you'll need a federal warrant and a company of cavalry to serve it." The standoff had evolved into something larger than anyone had anticipated. What began as a simple dispute over 5 refugee women had become a clash between competing definitions of justice, authority, and cultural survival. The various factions faced each other across Finn's ranch yard, each representing different visions of how civilized people should govern themselves. Nanama raised her rifle skyward and fired another shot, the sound echoing across the prairie like a thunderclap. When the reverberations died away, she spoke with the authority of someone who had earned the right to make final pronouncements. "Enough talk. These women have spoken. The white rancher has chosen his path, and the spirits have made their will known. Young warriors, you have 2 choices. Return to your families and tell them you could not drag 5 women from sanctuary because an old grandmother and a white man stood in your way, or fight and explain to the spirits why you spilled blood to enforce the will of men who have forgotten their own mothers' names." The challenge was direct and devastating. Maka and his warriors faced a choice that would define them for the rest of their lives. They could retreat and face ridicule, or they could attack an elderly woman and a man who was protecting refugees, actions that would violate every principle of honor their traditional culture had ever taught them. As the morning sun climbed toward its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the ranch yard, the confrontation hung in perfect balance. 8 armed men faced an old woman, a reclusive rancher, and 5 refugee women in a standoff that would determine not just the fate of individuals, but the future of an entire people's relationship with the changing world around them. The next word spoken would either prevent a massacre or trigger one, and every person present understood that they stood at a crossroads from which there would be no retreat. The silence stretched across the ranch yard like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. Each second waited with the possibility of violence that would stain the Nebraska soil with blood. But it was broken not by gunfire or war cries, but by the sound of approaching thunder that grew steadily louder until it resolved into the drumming of hooves. From the east came a sight that changed everything. 200 Ponca riders cresting the hill in perfect formation, their horses moving as one body across the prairie grass. At their head rode Chief Standing Bear himself, the legendary leader, whose very presence commanded respect from both white and Indian alike. His war bonnet streamed behind him in the morning wind, each eagle feather representing battles fought and honors earned over 6 decades of leadership. But what made the approaching force truly formidable was its composition. These were not young warriors seeking glory, but the full council of elders, the mature men and women who remembered when the Ponca nation had been strong and united. Micah's face went pale as he recognized the implications. The tribal council he claimed to represent was arriving in force, but they were coming to judge him rather than support him. Word of the village burning had spread through the reservation faster than prairie fire, and the elders had assembled to witness what their young leaders had done in the name of progress and white approval. Agent Morrison's carefully constructed authority began crumbling as he realized that his neat administrative solution was becoming a public spectacle that would be remembered for generations. The arrival of the full tribal leadership transformed a simple law enforcement action into a referendum on his entire approach to Indian administration. Every decision he had made, every compromise he had forced on the Ponca people, would now be examined by those who had lived through the consequences. Chief Standing Bear dismounted with the deliberate grace of a man who understood the power of theater and politics. His weathered face showed no emotion as he surveyed the scene. 8 young warriors facing off against an elderly woman, 5 refugee Ponca women, and a white rancher who had offered them sanctuary. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Maka, son of my sister, explain to me why you ride with weapons drawn against Nanama, who taught your mother to weave and sang at your birth ceremony. The question was delivered in English, ensuring that every person present would understand the shame being laid upon the young war leader. Explain why you threaten white man who honors old agreements while you break sacred laws of hospitality and protection. The indictment was devastating in its simplicity. By threatening violence against women who had sought sanctuary, Maka had violated fundamental principles that transcended any council's authority. Traditional Ponca law held that those who offered protection to the helpless took on sacred obligations that could not be overruled by political convenience. Maka struggled to find words that would justify his actions without admitting that he had been manipulated by white administrators into betraying his own people's values. Uncle, these women defied the council's authority, spoke against decisions made for the good of all Ponca people. The Indian agent said their actions threatened our treaty rights, that we must show we can govern ourselves according to white law if we want to keep our lands. Standing Bear's expression grew thunderous as he turned toward Agent Morrison, who suddenly found himself the focus of 200 pairs of hostile eyes. Agent Morrison, you told my young men that Ponca women must be silent like white women? You said our grandmother's wisdom was obstacle to civilization. You promised that if we abandoned our traditions, white government would let us keep our children and our land? Morrison's political instincts warned him that he was walking into a trap, but retreat would be as damaging as advance. Chief Standing Bear, the Department of the Interior has worked very hard to establish peaceful relations with all tribes. Sometimes that requires difficult adjustments to traditional practices that conflict with territorial law. These women were encouraging resistance to legitimate authority. Legitimate authority? Nanama's voice cracked like a whip, her 70 years of experience giving weight to every word. I negotiated the first treaty with white soldiers when you were still sucking milk from your mother's breast. I watched 7 different agents promise peace if we just gave up a little more of ourselves each time. Now you say Ponca women must be silent because white women obey their husbands without question? A murmur ran through the assembled riders. 200 voices expressing their opinion of that comparison. Many of these men had fought alongside Ponca women in battles against the Sioux, had seen their wives and daughters demonstrate courage that white women were never asked to show. The suggestion that their traditional partner equality should be abandoned to mimic the suppressed status of white females struck at the heart of their cultural identity. Tala stepped forward from the porch, moving with careful dignity despite her injuries. When she spoke, her voice carried across the ranch yard with the authority of someone who had earned the right to address chiefs and councils. Standing Bear's translation revealed words that would be remembered long after the participants were. Dust. She says that the white agent promised young men they could keep their lands if they made their women silent like white women. But she asks, what good are lands without the voices that remember their sacred names? What good are treaties that require a people to forget their own mothers? What good are promises from men who will be gone when their work here is finished, leaving us with nothing but broken traditions and empty hearts? The question struck at the fundamental deception underlying Morrison's administration. The agent had convinced young Ponca men that survival required cultural suicide, that they could preserve their physical existence only by destroying their spiritual identity. But Tala's words reminded everyone present Thata people without culture were not truly alive, merely existing as pale shadows of what they had once been. Standing Bear walked slowly toward the group of 5 women, his moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. When he reached them, he knelt before Kosa, the pregnant woman whose condition had made her the most vulnerable member of their group. He placed his weathered hand gently on her swollen belly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the tenderness of a grandfather addressing his own descendants. Little mother, the child you carry holds the future of our people in its heartbeat. Will it grow up knowing the songs its grandmothers sang, the stories that teach wisdom, the ceremonies that connect earth to sky? Or will it learn only the pale imitations that white men approve, speaking words that have no power because they carry no memory? He raised his eyes to meet hers, and his question was also a promise. What future do you choose for the life you carry? Kosa's response came in fluent Ponca, her young voice strengthened by the authority of impending motherhood. Standing Bear translated her words with obvious pride. She says the child will know its true name, will hear the old songs, will learn that Ponca's strength comes from honoring both the warrior and the woman, the hunter and the healer. She says the baby will grow up free, even if that freedom must be purchased with exile from people who have forgotten their own children's worth. The declaration reverberated through the assembled crowd like a stone thrown into still water. This was not just a political statement, but a generational challenge. A young mother claiming the right to raise her child according to principles that transcended any council's authority. Her words reminded everyone present that the future belonged not to those who compromised their values for temporary safety, but to those who preserved essential truths regardless of cost. Agent Morrison realized that his carefully constructed administrative edifice was collapsing before his eyes. The arrival of the full tribal leadership had transformed his neat law enforcement action into a public examination of his entire approach to Indian affairs. Every compromise he had forced, every tradition he had attacked, every voice he had silenced was now being weighed in the balance by those who had lived through the consequences. This is all very touching, Morrison said, attempting to reassert control through bureaucratic authority. But the law is the law. These women are fugitives from legitimate tribal justice. Chief Standing Bear, I'm ordering you to surrender them for processing through proper legal channels. Your treaty obligations require cooperation with territorial authorities. Standing Bear's response came with the cold finality of winter wind. Agent Morrison, show me the treaty that says Ponca men must beat pregnant women to prove their loyalty to white government. Show me the agreement that requires grandmothers to be burned from their homes for speaking wisdom. Show me the law that makes exile the punishment for remembering your own mother's name. His voice grew stronger with each challenge, backed by the murmured approval of 200 witnesses. The tribal leader walked to where Finn still stood with his Winchester trained on Maca, and for a moment, the two men studied each other across the cultural divide that separated their worlds. Standing Bear had heard stories about the white rancher who kept to himself but honored his agreements, who had shared water rights fairly for 40 years, and never cheated in his dealings with Indian traders. White man, Standing Bear said, using English to ensure that Agent Morrison understood every word. 40 summers ago you made agreement with Nanama for water rights. You kept that promise through drought and plenty, through times when other white men broke their word for profit. Today you offer sanctuary to women your own government calls criminals. Why do you risk everything for people who are not your blood? Finn's answer came without hesitation, his voice carrying across the ranch yard with the conviction of someone who had finally discovered what he was willing to die for. Chief Standing Bear, I spent 40 years hiding from responsibility, telling myself that isolation was strength and solitude was wisdom. These women reminded me that some things matter more than safety, that honor isn't about avoiding trouble but about standing up when trouble finds the innocent. He gestured toward the 5 women with his rifle barrel. They're not criminals. They're patriots who refuse to let their people forget what made them strong. The declaration sent another murmur through the assembled riders, this time carrying notes of respect and approval. A white man who understood the difference between law and justice, between authority and righteousness, was rare enough to be noteworthy. That he was willing to risk his life for that understanding made him worthy of honor. Standing Bear turned back toward Agent Morrison, and his expression had hardened into something that made the federal representative take an involuntary step backward. Agent Morrison, you have poisoned the minds of young men with promises you cannot keep and lies you know are false. You have convinced them that survival requires cultural suicide, that they can preserve their bodies only by killing their spirits. Today that stops. The chief raised his voice so that every person present could hear his words clearly. I, Standing Bear, chief of all Ponca people, declare that these 5 women are under the protection of the full tribal council. Any man who raises his hand against them raises it against me. Any agent who orders their arrest orders mine as well. They are guilty of no crime except remembering who they are and refusing to forget who their children must become. The pronouncement transformed the legal landscape instantly. Morrison's neat administrative solution had become a direct confrontation with the highest levels of tribal authority. Arresting the women now would require arresting the entire Ponca leadership, an action that would trigger the kind of Indian war the territorial government was desperate to avoid. But Standing Bear was not finished. He walked to where Maka sat his horse, still surrounded by his 7 warriors, and spoke with the terrible gentleness of a grandfather correcting a beloved but wayward child. Nephew, you have allowed white men to convince you that strength comes from abandoning the weak, that leadership means silencing those who question your wisdom. Today you learn the difference between power and authority, between commanding obedience and earning respect. The young war leader's face crumpled as he realized the magnitude of his error. In seeking to prove his fitness to lead through violence and intimidation, he had demonstrated exactly the opposite. True Ponca leadership had always been based on protecting the vulnerable, not punishing them for speaking truth. His actions had marked him as someone who had forgotten the most basic principles of his own culture. Uncle, Maka whispered, his voice breaking with shame and recognition. I thought I was protecting our people from white anger. The agent said they would take our lands if we could not prove we could govern like white men. I believed his lies because I feared his threats. Standing Bear's response carried the wisdom of someone who had navigated the treacherous waters of white Indian relations for 6 decades. Nephew, white men respect only strength, and strength comes from knowing who you are, not from pretending to be something else. A people who abandon their principles to appease their enemies have already lost everything worth preserving. Fear makes slaves, but courage makes nations. As the sun climbed toward its zenith and the confrontation reached its climax, Nanama fired her rifle one final time into the air. The shot echoed across the prairie like the voice of the ancestors themselves, calling their descendants back to the principles that had made them strong. When the sound died away, she spoke with the authority of someone who bridged the gap between the old world and the new. The choice is made. These women stay under the protection of those who remember what protection means. Agent Morrison, return to your office and write your reports. Tell your superiors that the Ponca people have remembered who they are and will not forget again. Tell them that some things cannot be bought with promises or stolen with threats. Her ancient eyes fixed on Morrison with laser intensity. Tell them that grandmothers still have teeth and we know how to use them. The federal agent found himself facing a united front that included not just 5 refugee women and their white protector, but the entire traditional leadership of the Ponca Nation. His neat administrative solution had become a political disaster that would reverberate through the territorial government for years to come. The price of forcing cultural assimilation had suddenly become too high to pay. As Morrison and his marshals mounted their horses for the long ride back to territorial headquarters, defeated by the simple power of people who refused to abandon their principles, Standing Bear walked to where Finn still held his Winchester. The two men looked at each other across the cultural divide that separated their worlds, and found in each other's eyes the recognition of shared values that transcended race and nationality. "White Rancher," Standing Bear said, extending his hand in the universal gesture of respect between equals. "You have honored the old agreements and made new ones today. Your ranch will always be welcome ground for Ponca people, and Ponca people will always be welcome at your fire. This I promise. On the bones of my ancestors and the breath of my children." Finn lowered his rifle and clasped the chief's hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of a lifetime spent in honest labor and honorable struggle. "Chief Standing Bear, these women have taught me that honor isn't about avoiding responsibility, but accepting it. They'll have sanctuary here as long as they need it, and any who follow them will find the same welcome." As the federal officials rode away in defeat, and the Ponca warriors began the process of returning to their families with their shame intact but their honor restored, the 5 women stood on Finn's porch and watched the transformation of their world. They had risked everything to preserve principles that seemed doomed to extinction, and had discovered that sometimes the greatest victories come from the simple act of refusing to surrender what matters most. The confrontation that had begun with threats of violence had ended with the restoration of dignity to all involved. Fear had given way to courage, division to unity, and the rigid demands of assimilation to the flexible strength of cultural preservation. The price of honor had been paid not in blood, but in the courage to remember who they were and refuse to become what others demanded they should be. 3 years later, the Nebraska Territory had transformed around Ashworth Ranch in ways that no one could have predicted when 5 bleeding women first sought sanctuary at Finn's door. The homestead that had once echoed with the loneliness of a single man now bustled with the sounds of a community that had grown far beyond its original inhabitants. Where once only cattle had grazed, now gardens flourished under the careful tending of women who understood that survival meant more than just staying alive. Kosa's son had been born during the first winter of their refuge, arriving during a blizzard that had seemed to mirror the storm of controversy surrounding his mother's presence on white man's land. Finn had assisted at the birth, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he helped bring new life into a world that had tried to deny its right to exist. The boy, named Tokala for the swift fox that had appeared outside the ranch house on the night of his birth, now ran through the yard with the boundless energy of childhood, equally comfortable speaking Ponca with his mother or English with the man he called Grandfather Finn. The other women had found their own paths to healing and purpose within the strange sanctuary that had become their home. Tyla had established herself as the unofficial leader of what had grown into a network of refuge for displaced Native women throughout the territory. Her organizational skills, honed through years of tribal governance, now served to coordinate resources and provide support for dozens of women who had been cast out by their own communities for the crime of speaking uncomfortable truths. Nina, no longer the frightened 16-year-old who had wept in Finn's cave, had blossomed into a confident young woman whose artistic talents had found expression in the intricate beadwork and pottery that now adorned every room of the ranch house. Her creations had become sought after by traders from as far away as Denver, providing the community with an independent source of income that freed them from dependence on Finn's charity. Shappa had recovered the full use of her injured arm and had put her mechanical abilities to work improving the ranch's infrastructure in ways that amazed even Finn, who had thought himself a master of frontier engineering. Under her direction, they had built an irrigation system that doubled crop yields, constructed workshops that allowed them to manufacture their own tools and furniture, and established a communications network with neighboring ranches that had transformed the isolated homestead into a hub of regional activity. Shappa's healing skills had made her indispensable not just to their own community, but to white settlers throughout the area who had learned that her knowledge of herbal medicine often succeeded where conventional treatments failed. Her patient roster included the wives of territorial officials who had once demanded her arrest, a irony that she bore with the gentle humor of someone who understood that enemies could become allies given sufficient time and necessity. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation had been in Finn himself. The man who had spent 40 years avoiding human contact now found himself at the center of a thriving community that looked to him for leadership, guidance, and protection. His house, designed for a family he'd never had, now sheltered a chosen family that had grown to include not just the original 5 women, but their children, visiting relatives, and a steady stream of refugees who had heard that sanctuary could be found at Ashworth Ranch. The legal implications of their community had required careful navigation through territorial and federal bureaucracy. Standing Bear's protection had shielded them from immediate government interference, but long-term security required more formal arrangements. Working with sympathetic lawyers in Omaha, Finn had established the ranch as an official settlement under territorial homestead law, with each of the women granted legal status as permanent residents with full property rights. Agent Morrison had been quietly transferred to a desk job in Washington, D.C. after the debacle of his confrontation at the ranch, replaced by a more pragmatic administrator who understood that accommodation often achieved better results than confrontation. The new agent, James Whitehorse, was himself part Cheyenne and brought a nuanced understanding of Indian affairs that his predecessor had lacked. The arrangement that emerged was unprecedented in territorial history, a legally recognized mixed community where Indian women enjoyed the same rights as white settlers, where traditional practices were preserved alongside modern innovations, and where cultural difference was seen as strength rather than threat. Other territories began sending delegations to study their model, hoping to replicate their success in managing Indian relations. Word of their community had spread throughout Indian country, inspiring similar experiments in cultural preservation and women's rights among tribes from the Dakotas to the Oklahoma Territory. Tarla had begun traveling to reservations throughout the region, sharing her experiences and helping other women organize resistance to forced assimilation policies. Her speeches, delivered in a mixture of English and various tribal languages, had made her a recognized leader in what was becoming a pan-Indian women's movement. The ranch's economic success had exceeded everyone's expectations. What had begun as subsistence agriculture had evolved into a diverse enterprise that included cattle ranching, crop production, craft manufacturing, and trading operations that extended from Kansas City to Denver. Their prosperity had been built on the principle that cooperation produced better results than competition, that shared knowledge multiplied individual capabilities. Educational opportunities had been a priority from the beginning. Nina had taught herself to read and write English fluently, then had turned her attention to preserving Ponca language and traditions in written form. Working with tribal elders, she had compiled dictionaries, recorded oral histories, and transcribed songs and ceremonies that might otherwise have been lost to the pressures of assimilation. Her work had become a model for cultural preservation efforts throughout Indian country. The children who had been born or raised at the ranch grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable in both worlds but fully belonging to neither. This unique perspective had made them natural intermediaries between Indian and white communities, and several had already distinguished themselves as translators, negotiators, and cultural ambassadors. Young Tokala, now 3 years old, switched between languages with the unconscious fluency of someone for whom cultural boundaries were meaningless. Religious practices had evolved into a unique synthesis that respected both Christian and traditional Indian beliefs without forcing anyone to choose between them. Sunday services led by a visiting Methodist minister were followed by traditional ceremonies conducted by tribal elders, creating a spiritual environment that offered multiple paths to the divine. The synthesis had attracted interest from theologians and anthropologists who saw it as a model for religious accommodation in an increasingly diverse society. Marriage patterns within the community had challenged conventional expectations about interracial relationships. 2 of the women had married white settlers who had proven worthy of acceptance into their extended family, while others had chosen partners from various tribes who shared their commitment to cultural preservation. The marriages had produced children who embodied the possibility of harmony between different peoples, living proof that racial barriers were artificial constructs that could be overcome through mutual respect and understanding. Finn's own transformation had been perhaps the most remarkable of all. The man who had once spoken only to cattle and wind now found himself a reluctant but effective spokesman for progressive Indian policy, testifying before territorial legislatures and congressional committees about the success of their integrated community. His 40 years of isolation had given him a unique credibility among white settlers, who might have dismissed the same arguments coming from Indian advocates. The ranch house that had once felt too large for one lonely man now seemed barely adequate for the extended family that called it home. Additional buildings had been constructed to accommodate the growing population: dormitories for visiting relatives, workshops for various crafts and trades, a school where children learned both traditional knowledge and modern skills, a medical clinic where Wappa trained apprentices in the healing arts. But success had brought new challenges that tested the community's resilience and commitment to their founding principles. Economic prosperity had attracted the attention of business interests who wanted to exploit their innovations for profit without sharing the benefits with their creators. Political success had created enemies among those who saw their model as a threat to conventional approaches to Indian affairs. Even their fame had become a burden, as curiosity seekers and sensation writers invaded their privacy in search of stories that often misrepresented their actual experiences. The most serious challenge had come from within the Indian community itself, where some leaders accused them of abandoning their people by integrating too closely with white society. These critics argued that true cultural preservation required complete separation from white influence, that any compromise with the dominant culture inevitably led to assimilation and cultural death. The accusations had forced difficult conversations about the balance between adaptation and preservation, between pragmatic survival and idealistic purity. Nanama, now 73 and increasingly frail, had become the community's elder stateswoman and final arbiter of disputes that threatened their unity. Her wisdom, earned through decades of navigating the treacherous currents of cultural change, provided guidance for decisions that would determine their future direction. Her presence served as a living link to the traditional world they sought to preserve while building something new and unprecedented. The question of succession had become increasingly urgent as the original founders aged, and their roles needed to be assumed by the next generation. Leadership positions that had emerged organically in response to immediate needs now required formal structures that could ensure continuity without stifling the flexibility that had made their success possible. The challenge was creating institutions that preserved their values while adapting to changing circumstances. Standing Bear's health had begun to fail, and his death would remove their most important political protector within the traditional tribal structure. While their legal status was now secure under territorial law, Their acceptance within Indian country still depended on his personal authority and the respect he commanded among tribal leaders. Planning for his eventual succession required careful negotiation among various factions within the Ponca nation. The territorial government had begun pressuring them to formalize their status as an incorporated town, a change that would bring benefits in terms of federal funding and political representation, but would also subject them to regulations that might compromise their unique cultural arrangements. The decision would determine whether they remained an informal community bound together by shared values or became an official municipality subject to conventional governance structures. As Finn stood on his front porch on a warm September evening, watching Tokala play with the other children while their mothers prepared the evening meal, he reflected on the chain of choices that had led to this moment. 3 years ago, he had been a lonely man whose only companion was regret, whose only purpose was the maintenance of property that would die with him. Now he was the patriarch of a thriving community that had become a beacon of hope for displaced people throughout the territory. The 5 women who had transformed his life had themselves been transformed by the experience of building something new from the ruins of what they had lost. They had learned that preservation sometimes required change, that tradition could be strengthened by adaptation, that cultural survival depended not on rigid adherence to the past, but on creative engagement with the future. Their success had proven that different peoples could live together without one destroying the other. That diversity was strength rather than weakness. The evening meal brought together 3 generations around a table that groaned under the weight of foods that reflected their multicultural heritage. Traditional Ponca dishes prepared according to ancient recipes, frontier staples adapted to accommodate different dietary preferences, and innovations that had emerged from the creative fusion of different culinary traditions. The conversation flowed between languages and topics with the easy familiarity of people who had learned to see difference as enrichment rather than division. After the meal, as had become their custom, the community gathered on the front porch to share stories, songs, and plans for the future. Children played games that combined elements from different cultures, while adults discussed business matters, political developments, and community concerns with the collaborative spirit that had made their success possible. These evening gatherings had become the heartbeat of their community, the daily ritual that reinforced their bonds and renewed their commitment to their shared vision. As the sun set over the Nebraska prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded everyone present of the beauty that could emerge from the marriage of earth and sky, Finn Ashworth understood that his life had been divided into 2 distinct chapters. The 40 years before 5 desperate women had appeared at his door, and everything that had happened since. The first chapter had been about survival, about enduring loss and loneliness through sheer stubborn determination. The second chapter had been about living, about discovering that meaning came not from isolation, but from connection. Not from protecting oneself from pain, but from opening oneself to joy. The ranch that had once been a fortress against the world had become a bridge between worlds, proving that sanctuary was not about walls that kept others out, but about welcome that brought others in. The women who had sought refuge had become leaders who offered refuge to others, creating an endless cycle of rescue and redemption that had transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. The man who had spoken only to the wind for 40 winters had learned to speak the language of community, of hope, of love that transcended the boundaries that divided peoples and cultures. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky and the community prepared for another night of peaceful sleep under the protection of those who had learned that true strength came from caring for others rather than protecting oneself, Finn Ashworth smiled with the deep satisfaction of a man who had finally discovered what he was meant to do with his life. He had built something that would outlast him, something that would continue to offer sanctuary to those who needed it long after he was gone. The lonely rancher who had lived alone for 40 winters had learned the greatest lesson of all. That home was not a place but a people, that family was not blood but choice, and that the highest purpose any person could serve was to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. The 5 outcast Ponca women who had begged for safety on his land had given him the greatest gift imaginable. They had taught him how to be fully human again.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.